Now, my first question about your plays would be, if you look back, I'm not suggesting that the conferment of an award is the turning point, but if you take it as a moment for some kind of retrospection, now how would you look back and how would you summarize what you have been doing with this medium? How have you been trying to make a blend of your interest in this multifaceted medium and your concerns?
Well, I think I have made the best of my limitations rather than I can't invent stories. So automatically I was stuck to myths and legends and so on. And I can't write stories or novels, so I was stuck to plays. I mean, it's something that I couldn't do anything else. If you look at the previous Kannada Jnanpith Award winners, particularly Puttappa or Shivram Karant, well, they did a lot of things. I mean, they wrote novels, they wrote poetry, they wrote plays, Bendre too wrote plays and wrote excellent prose and so on. Well, this was a choice which I think has not been open to me. I've always wanted to write plays. That's all I'm capable of doing. I write dialogues, but I can't write descriptions. So the form was practically forced upon me, I think.
You have said quite often that you almost stumbled upon this form, when you wrote your first play. And you also mentioned the manner in which you have relied on the mythological material available and also the narratives available in our tradition. On the one hand, it appears as though you are trying to distance yourself from what happens on your stage, on your theatre. At the same time, all your major plays have had much to do with your personal concerns. For example, when you wrote your first play, you were trying to make sense of the turmoil that you were going through.
Yes.
And you were also trying to face questions of how to confront a parental authority and what would happen in this conflict between generations.
Yes, actually I wanted to be a poet. And I think the day I realized when I was about 22 or 23 that I'll never be a poet, I could have cried, really. And I still feel a great sense of disappointment that I couldn't become, a Bendre or an Adiga or a Chandrasekhar Kambar, for instance. And of course I was always interested in theatre, and I've been acting since a very young age in schools and so on. But as you were referring, I was about to leave for England when I was about 22 years old. I got the Rhodes Scholarship, and there were a great deal of tensions. Travel in those days was not as simple as it's today, and I didn't know whether to go abroad, stay there, come back, which way the future would go, and my parents were insisting I should come back, whatever happens, and choose my career here. And it was in that situation that I suddenly found myself writing Yayati. It sort of just burst out of me. I just felt like a stenotypist. And I could see all the characters talking to each other while I was writing down all that they were saying. And the play was published with very few corrections by Kirtinath Kuskoti much later. And now, when that happened, I suddenly realized that I was cut out to be a playwright. Because, it came out as a play, it came out in Kannada. I used to write my poetry in English because I thought that was the language of Eliot and Pound and W.H. Auden. And I thought I was alienated from my background, from my history, from my mythology, and here I was writing on Yayati and Puru, the tension between the father and the son. So that play immediately sort of nailed me to my past, I think. After that, I've never had any question as to what I should be doing.
Now, on the one hand, of course, there has been this use of the past that you have been trying to discover. But at the same time, as I was suggesting, every time you write a play, it seems to have something to do with something that bothers you at that time. At the time when you wrote Ayati, it was this confrontation of two generations. When you came to write Tughlaq, it was the disillusionment of the post-Nehruvian area. Now, the point I want you to make for the listeners is, how is it that you took up a very impersonal medium like the theatre, and yet you have tried to use it for expressing or discovering or dealing with these very personal kinds of concerns?
Well, some people have an idea that inspiration is something that's beautiful, something that's ecstatic, but it's not always so. Sometimes it's an irritant, like an oyster. The pearl is produced by an oyster out of irritation. So you get angry at something, and the Mandir and Masjid issue irritated me, angered me a great deal, the Ayodhya issue, and Taladanda was the result that came out of it. Because I felt these problems we seem to face perennially, although they have been faced earlier. Yes, that happens very often. I don't make a distinction between what I believe and what I would like to express and what irritates me and so on. It just happens. The thing is, I think the phrase for that is probably the well-worn phrase of T.S. Eliot, objective correlative. Some myth, some legend provides the correct objective correlative for what you think or what you're going through. And that excites you. And really one writes because one wants to share one's excitement with people. Some story feels beautiful, some novel feels beautiful, and then you want to share it with other people.
With all the variety that one can see in the choice of themes and in the creation of a very different kind of theatre for each play that you write, one can also see some kind of a consistent probing.
I hope so.
For lack of a better word, I mean, the term existentialist could be used because most of your plays are about dualities and the ambivalences and the ambiguities. Of course, you are not in a big hurry to resolve any of them in your plays, but you're trying to probe into them. Now, could you tell us what prompted you on this kind of a search? I mean, which still persisted.
Well, it's true that I was greatly influenced by existentialism when I started writing. I mean, Sartre and Camus, and of course, at a very creative level and not at a thinking level, even someone like Anouilh, the French actually in the 1960s were a great influence, and they've continued to be so. But it also, I think, existentialism has also led me to look for other thoughts which are related to it. And very many people who have sort of reviewed Agnimattumale, for instance, don't know that a lot of what Paravasu says in it is from the Mimamsa school of philosophy.
Yes.
When he's talking of meaning and you can create the meaning you like out of words that are given to you and so on. And everyone thinks that this is postmodernist, the Girish talking in postmodernist terms. But it isn't. It's absolutely straight out of Mimamsa texts or Mimamsa explanations. Similarly, the notion of how gods can be brought down by the mantras. It sounds a very Sartrean statement to make, but it's not. I mean, that's what the Brahmins believed, and they say that in their mantras, in Brahmanas and so on. You get this. So I think I have developed, and I think I have absorbed many new ideas, but fortunately, or it may be a sign that I can't develop, that's also possible, one has been able to sort of bring them together into some kind of a relationship with each other, even if it's a contradictory relationship.
Yes, I was suggesting that you have not been in a hurry to resolve them because simplistic solutions are always available. The other question that I wanted to ask you was about the way in which you look at the system, whether it's a political system or a social structure, whether it's Talidanda or Tughlaq or Agnimattumale. There's always this kind of delineation in your plays, that this system can go through ironical reversals and it can still persist, in the way in which harasses the individuals and imprisons them. Could you elaborate on this?
Well, it would be very difficult. Actually, it's very difficult to talk about what my plays are about to me. Simply because all this probably comes... I work very hard on my plays, I must tell you that. Whenever Sriranga used to say that he starts with the first letter and writes through and ends with the last full stop, I used to envy him. Because playwriting, except for Yayati, has not been easy at all. That's why it takes a long time, and Agnimattumale I mulled over for nearly 35 years. I wanted to write it soon after Tughlaq. This means, of course, that for years, all that one has read, all that one has suffered, all that one has heard goes into it. Yes. And it absorbs and it takes shape, and you try to keep molding it. I like to think of a play as an architect would like to think of a building, which is that, you can't just put a pillar anywhere. You need to have a pillar in a particular place, and you must have a staircase in a particular place, and if they're not properly aligned, then the structure will collapse. And the play is exactly like that. The emotional and the intellectual contents of the play cannot be separated for that reason. You cannot have an emotional scene and then say, okay, I'll pad it around with intellectual, additions to it. The two have to relate to each other so that the structure can hold together. And so I suppose it would be very difficult for me to say whether one is reacting to something intellectually or one is reacting to something emotionally. Because I have found that whatever intellectual arguments one brings or people bring are a justification for their emotional reactions.
It's not the other way around.
No, not at all. The intellectual arguments come later and they justify the emotional state.
In a very brilliant discursive piece you wrote in search of theatre. You have mentioned many problems which I think have not been sorted out yet, in the sense, as a young playwright, you felt that while returning to mythological material, there was still that hiatus, a break between what you were as a representative of the modern generation and the kind of material you were choosing. Plus, there was also the way in which the audience was being situated, with a kind of professional theatre contrasted with the amateur theatre. So from then your search has been for a total theatre. Now, how would you react to that? I mean, what have been the later phases in this search?
Well, the point is, theatre ultimately, however much you theorize or however many forms you find, theatre has to work when it is being done. There is the audience and there are the actors, and if that electricity doesn't work between the audience and the actors, then it's useless. No theory is useful. So ultimately, theatre is what happens then. That's why it's called a performing art. The Rasotpati takes place when the play is going on, and that chemistry has to happen. Now, that is the most important thing. Now, whether that happens or not. Then, of course, there's a whole history to it, and the history of Indian theatre is very complex, and it has absorbed all kinds of influences. And what we consider city theatre, urban theatre now, in fact, is the fall off of the colonial theatre. During the British days, early 19th century, and so on. So all those things one can ignore, but I find it fascinating to see what one can absorb out of all that. By looking at history, by looking at Sanskrit theatre. I think there is a lot of Sanskrit theatre, or at least my study of Sanskrit theatre and Natya Shastra in Agnimattu Malai. And so one can go on. For instance, the whole notion of what is a mythological. Now, Agnimattu Malai would be a mythological because it's about a myth. But Pauranic in our sense has come to mean that which is drenched in Bhakti Rasa. Therefore, when you say Pauranic, it's about Rama, or it's Krishna, it's about Pandavas, it's about the epics, which basically talk of Bhakti. But there is a lot of mythology, there is a lot of Puranas which are not Bhakti oriented, and we have a lot of legends like the story of Yavakri, which are very beautiful and which are, in a sense, don't want to use the word, very Spartan, Greek, almost. And those have not been touched at all in Indian playwriting. And in Agnimattu Malai, that was an attempt, at least. And similarly with oral tales, and similarly with fairy tales, folk tales, and so on. There's so much potential there which can be explored, and which has not been touched upon by playwriting.
Your plays have been translated and then later performed in most of the regional theatres in India. So you have had a wide experience of different kinds of reception and different kinds of performances. On the basis of that, would you agree that we can subscribe to the notion of an Indian theatre? One of your fellow theatre personalities in Karnataka has described the notion of a national theatre as a dream that turned into a nightmare. But what would be your own experience? I mean, just based on your background.
I wish it was even a nightmare. I wish it was as concrete as a nightmare. I think it's practically non-existent. But the notion is not non-existent. I think it's true, for instance, that let me give an example. When I wrote Tughlaq, and it was received so warmly, so well, I was surprised to some extent because a lot of Tughlaq derives from Brecht, a lot of Tughlaq derives from Shakespeare, Shakespearean history plays and so on. But the fact remains that people may have known Shakespeare, they may have liked Richard III, but when they see something happening in the terms of their own cultural history, it has a different impact. They may have seen greater plays, they may have seen Shakespearean plays and so on. They may have seen history plays by Brecht. But when you see a play about Baswana or about Tughlaq, it touches you because it's Indian history, it's Indian context, that somewhere touches upon the whole notion of, at least an Indian experience. I mean, I'm not a nationalist in that sense. I mean, I don't believe in, but I would say that yes, there is something that strikes one as Indian, particularly, and that will hold that Indian theatre together. I think what makes me respond to Badal Sarkar, what makes me respond to Tendulkar, for instance, both of whom I consider very important playwrights. And I must mention that I was one of the reasons I was surprised when I got the Jnanpith is I thought if it came to theatre, it would go to either of them, either Tendulkar or Badal Sarkar, because they have done a lot of work and they are much more, much older, more senior to me.
No one would disagree with you that they have done a lot for the Indian theatre, but at the same time, you need not be so very modest about your achievements either. Now, just one more question, and the question is about the way in which you have of late tried to engage yourself with some very contemporary questions and questions which could even be described as very local. You have been more participatory and you have been transforming yourself into some kind of an activist also. Now, how would you describe this phase?
Well, I think what worries one is the increase in a kind of destructive elements in society. It's destructive environmentally, it's destructive culturally, and I feel that somewhere we have to make a stand. Otherwise, whatever values that we have in our society will get destroyed.
No, in fact, I even wanted to suggest that indirectly this is a threat to the theatre, because I'm sure in the Indian tradition the theatre has always been looked upon as secular.
Yeah, I know.
It has never been confined to either the religious or to... In fact, I was about to suggest that in the Indian Natya tradition, theatre and drama have always been taken to be secular, in a way very different from the religious and other concerns. So would you like to relate that to what the drama and the theatre can do in the present social context?
Well, I don't think drama can or theatre can do political revolution. I mean, it cannot revolutionize society. It can only make people aware of the problems. It can make people think. I don't know whether it can make people act, because one of the principal points of I think Rasotpati is that it makes you forget yourself. I mean, you forget yourself in the drama. It doesn't make you go back to society as such. That may be political pamphleteering. But I think good drama then would make you sensitive to the issues. It's not make you analyze given issues around you, but sensitive to the human aspects of the issues involved. I think that's what drama can do. That sensitize you, make you more aware, make you more sensitive.
In talking about Talidand, I had used a very graphic metaphor, and you said that like the tongue returning again and again to painful truth. Kannada literature had been returning to the theme of what happened in the 12th century. Now, talking about a choice of such a subject matter, what about your play On the Anvil? We have heard that you're working on Tipu Sultan and material relating to Tipu Sultan.
Well, I'm not. I have already written the play. I wrote it 2 years ago. What happened was, BBC Radio asked me to write a play for the 50th year of Indian independence, for broadcasting on 15th August 1997. And they said it would be better if it was in some way connected it showed a connection between India and Britain. So I said, well, if you want a subject that's related to India and Britain, then let me take a subject from Karnataka itself, from the Karnataka history. And then I took Tipu Sultan, because I admire Tipu Sultan greatly. And I wrote the play, and it was broadcast from London. It was directed by Jatin Verma, and I think Saeed Jaffrey acted as Tipu Sultan. And it was quite successful, very well received. But I cannot write originally in English. I need to write in Kannada first and then translate it. So I had to write the Kannada play anyway. So then I corrected it a bit, made a few corrections, and handed it over to Basavalinga because of Rangayana.
Yes.
Which is the repertory theatre run by the Karnataka government, because ultimately the point is, it's not only was 1997 the 50th year of Indian independence, 1999 actually is it's 200 years since the death of Tipu Sultan, and I think Tipu Sultan's place in the history of Karnataka is really as great as Shivaji's in the history of Maharashtra. He has done as much to unite the Mysore state, what ultimately became Mysore state, and his contribution to the industry, to the economy, to the culture of the place has not been acknowledged, simply because the British hated him and they quite unjustly destroyed him, and they had to justify it, and the Mysore Maharajas were dependent on the mercies of the British government. Then had to toe the line,
yes,
and say that yes, he was as the British had described. But there's a lot of evidence to prove that he started the silk industry, he started the sandalwood industry, he started state corporations in Karnataka. And Praxi Fernandes, who was the first secretary to Karnataka government a few years ago, chief secretary, has written to say that before the world of planning came, Mysore was way ahead in industrial production and in a planned economy, simply because of the efforts which had been begun by Tipu Sultan. So I think the economic side of it, like in Talidand also, where the economic side is not just a formal side, it's a human side. It's the human side that attracts me. But the play is called Tipu Sultan Kandakanasu. It's called The Dreams of Tipu Sultan because Tipu Sultan had a very extraordinary habit of noting down all his dreams.
Yes.
And they have found a diary in which 38 of his dreams are noted in great detail. And those dreams also form a part of the play. You know, the dreams also are part of the scenes of the play. So that's the play. That's the play.
And I'm sure, like all your previous plays, this play is also going to be a very major event for Kannada theatre and
Thank you. I
Indian
hope so
theatre.
too.
And thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.